I wanted to really to thank Ari not only for leading this webinar tonight, as you called it, but also for volunteering to lead this webinar tonight. Yeah, and it's just an area in which he has some expertise in. So we're really grateful to him for sharing. As you could see on the flyer, he is a native of Ottawa. And is currently a therapist for JESA, Jewish Social Service Agency. Is that right?
Yep.
Okay, I got it. And has smicha from Israel and has served as a hospital chaplain. And so he and his wife, Francesca, relocated here. What month of 2020?
In the middle of January, just
Yeah,
before
so
all
he's
the
been a
roads
member of our community, the OHAVE community, for a while, but unfortunately, we all know, didn't give it too much time to actually acclimate. Anyway, so yeah, so just thrilled to have him. And Ari, I will let you lay out the guidelines for how you want to handle questions and things like that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Maharat Ruth, and for giving me this opportunity. It's very good to be able to do some learning with the community after being part of it for a year. Just an item or two of housekeeping. We're going to be listening to some music tonight, so I encourage people, if you're not currently watching this on an iPad or on a computer, to switch over to it, because there'll be subtitles, which are kind of hard to read on an iPhone, although not impossible. And we'll be muting everyone when I begin, but if you have clarifying questions or comments, please share them in the chat part of the screen. And then Maharat Ruth, can you read them out if they come in? Because I won't be able to see them when I'm showing the PowerPoint. Great. Okay, so without further ado, let's begin. Okay, Nefesh Yehudi, how Israelis express their Jewishness through music. Music is the most beloved art form in Israel, and it's not hard to see why. Music allows us to express things that can't be expressed in words. Rabbi Sachs, Zichrono Libracha, in one of the last lectures that he gave, talked about how there are some things in life that are so profound, we can't express them in words, we can only sing them. And Israelis are living with profundity every day, with the joy of living in the first Jewish state in 2,000 years and experiencing the renaissance of Judaism there. Also with the anxiety of living in a country that's under constant existential threat. As we unfortunately saw today when missiles were fired from Gaza towards Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. And music has been integral to the Israeli project from the very beginning. It's only a slight exaggeration to say that music helped the Chalutzim to drain the swamps and build the kibbutzim. It helped the Irgun and the Palmach to fight for the independence of the Jewish state, and later on for Israeli society to sustain itself. And now in 2021, music is playing a role in the cultural revolution that's happening quietly but significantly in Israel, which is what some have called the rejuvenation of Israel, the reclamation of Judaism by Israeli society. 87% of Israeli Jews believe that Judaism is very important for their lives. But the question is, how much Judaism? And what form is it going to take? And this is one of the most fascinating and also one of the most confounding currents in Israeli life today. Israel is the first Jewish state in 2,000 years. It's the first Jewish democracy that has ever existed. And what role is Judaism going to play in all of that? Should it be the biblical vision of being a Mamlechet Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh, a nation of priests and holy people who will work to bring about the Mashiach? Or should it be a form of personal inspiration? Judaism is a resource that helps us to grow as human beings, to become mention. And this is something that's animating Israeli public discourse, and that's alive in the personal lives of so many Israelis. One of the best studies that has ever been published about the role of Judaism in Israel is this book that came out in 2018, hashtag Israeli Judaism, Portrait of a Cultural Revolution. It distills the work of Camille Fuchs, one of Israel's leading sociologists, who works for the Jewish Peoplehood Institute in Jerusalem. And he collaborated with Shmuel Rosner, who's one of Israel's greatest journalists. It's a very readable book, and I recommend it to everyone who cares about Israel. And on one foot, their conclusion is, there is a new Jew, and she lives in Israel. She practices Judaism like no Judaism before it, and like no Judaism anywhere else. It's a Judaism unique to a place and time, an amalgamation of tradition and nationality. Another core idea in the book is a value that about 85% of Israelis subscribe to. A good Jew serves in the IDF and observes Shabbat and festivals in some form or another. So being Jewish isn't just a private thing that you do in the confines of your shul or in your home. It's something that is played out on the national stage. It's played out through safeguarding the country, through serving in the IDF, and also through observing Shabbat and Chagim. The chart that you see on the right shows the 4 key groups in Israel in terms of Jewishness. On the upper right, we have the largest group, the Jew-Raelis. That's what Rosner and Fuchs call it. These are people who are Masorati. They observe Shabbat and festivals, not necessarily according to halacha, but Shabbat and festivals are significant for them. Learning Torah and exploring Judaism are significant for them, as is serving the state of Israel. On the bottom right are the Israelis, 15%. These are the leftovers of the old labor Zionist ideology. They're primarily Ashkenazi. They feel a strong connection to the Jewish people, but not to the Jewish religion. On the bottom left are the Universalists, the smallest group. These are Jewish Israelis who feel neither connected to the Jewish people or to Judaism. They see themselves as citizens of the world, and they mainly live in Tel Aviv. On the upper left are the Jews. This refers almost exclusively to the Haredi, or ultra-Orthodox community. These are people who feel a strong affiliation with Judaism, but not a strong affiliation with the state of Israel. That doesn't mean that they are anti-Zionist, but it's parav for them. They accept the state, but they don't celebrate it or serve in the army. What brings together all three of the groups that feel either a connection to Judaism or to the Jewish people is music. It cuts across all lines. It's something participatory that builds community. And the best Israeli artists are able to attract a following everywhere from the Haredi part of Israeli society through to the Israeli part of the society. And it's an amazing experience to go to a good concert and be able to see all of Klal Yisrael there, the full cross-section of Israeli society, listening to an artist who integrates their personal experience with their experience of being Jewish in a Jewish state and relating to Torah in that context. My teacher, Yossi Klein Halevi, writes, like Israeli society, our music is constantly reinventing itself. Music saturates the Israeli experience. I began to recognize lines from songs in our ever malleable slang and even in newspaper headlines. And I came to regard our great musicians with the affection we reserve for intimate friends. Because Israel is a small country of only 7 million people and a very inward-looking country, if you're a talented musician and you manage to get your music in circulation, you can not only develop a following across Israeli society, but your music becomes a part of people's lives. The ultimate tribute paid to some of Israel's best artists is that their work is not only listened to, but memorized and sung. And for some of the religious artists that we're going to hear today, their music has even made it into the Nusach. Some of the piyutim, the prayer poems that they've written, are used in shuls every Shabbat. Let's go back to the beginning, to 1948. The state is proclaimed 74 years ago this week on the Gregorian calendar on May 14th, 1948. And if Ben-Gurion's agenda could be summed up with one word, it would be mamlachtiyut, statism. He wanted to create the structure and the identity for the first ever Jewish democratic state. And in the education system, this was summarized under the heading from the Tanakh to the Palmach. In other words, from the last period where there was Jewish sovereignty, as represented by the Tanakh and the period of the Second Temple. And then the education system would skip over the next 2,000 years of diaspora life, halakha, the rabbinic tradition, and everything else that was achieved in our exile, and pick up again with Zionism, represented by the Palmach, the pre-state underground militia. And Ben-Gurion and those around him envisioned Judaism as being the national story. There was not room for God. There was not room for religious observance. It was very much an issue of ethnic identity. The War of Independence in 1948 was fought by a ragtag, poorly armed army. In the 1950s, the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, Tzahal, was built up into a real fighting force. And its first great test was in the Sinai campaign of 1956. which is the subject of the first song that we'll be listening to. Something of great symbolic value happened during that war, which was the capture of Mount Sinai. Now, we know from archaeologists that this site, which is called Mount Sinai, is not the real Mount Sinai. It's not Horeb, where Moshe Rabbeinu received the Torah from Hashem and gave it to the Jewish people. Nevertheless, there's a popular belief that it is Mount Sinai. And in the bottom right, you see that Mount Sinai and the monastery of Santa Caterina at the bottom. And so, like every other great national event, Bayamim Hahem, a song was written about it. And this song, for me, really represents Mamlachtiyut, represents the appropriation of Judaism for the national identity. So let's take a listen to it. And as you're listening to it, see what you can pick up from it about how the new state of Israel wants to understand its relationship to Judaism. One moment.
שלבת ים עיני הנערים, שלבת ים ברום המנועים, עוד יסופר על זה היום החי, בשוב העם אל מעמד סיני. לא אגדה רעי, לא אגדה רעי, ולא חלום עובר, הנה מול הר סיני, הנה מול הר סיני, אסנה אסנה בוער.
ומולו איזה שיר, לפי גדודי פנים בשערי העיר ויד ששרים.
שלבת ים עיני הנערים, שלבת ים ברום המנועים, עוד יסופר על זה היום החי, בשוב העם אל מעמד סיני. רעי זה לא חלום, רעי זה לא חלום, זה לא חזיון עוזר. מאז ועד היום, מאז ועד היום, בוער בוער הסנה.
לוהט בסבר עול, בלבבות האש נערי ציון.
שלבת ים עיני הנערים, שלבת ים ברום המנועים, עוד יסופר על זה היום החי, בשוב העם אל מעמד סיני. שלבת ים עיני הנערים, שלבת ים ברום המנועים, עוד יסופר על זה היום החי, בשוב העם אל מעמד סיני. שלבת ים עיני הנערים, שלבת ים ברום המנועים, עוד יסופר על זה היום החי, בשוב העם אל מעמד סיני.
So if you've noticed anything that you'd like to share, please feel free to share it in the chat. I'll share a thing or two that I noticed about this. There's a lot of symbolism in this song, especially in the verse that you see on the right, where it says, Ra'ai zelo chalom v'lo chezyon chozer. Comrades, this is not a dream. This is not the vision of a visionary. From then until now, from the time of the original Har Sinai until now, Bo'er Hasneh, the bush is burning, the burning bush which burns and burns but is never consumed, which is like the Jewish people. And then it says, Lohet bezemer on belivavot ha'el. It burns in the power of song in the godly hearts, shel na'arei Tzion v'rechev Yisrael, of the youth of Zion and the chariots of Israel. The godly hearts. This is a this is a way of laying claim to the idea that God is no longer HaKadosh Baruch Hu. God is within us. God is the collective energy of the nation coming together and reclaiming its independence and fighting for its survival. And then it says, Na'arei Tzion v'rechav Yisrael. Those are lines that are straight out of the Tanakh. We're the heirs to Yeshua and everyone who conquered the land 3,000 years ago. We are reliving the story of the Tanakh in Yoshua and Shoftim. And we're on the right side of Jewish history. The problem is, what about people who don't want to get with the program? What about the 50% of Israeli society who were Sfaradim and Mizrahim, who were traditional Jews from Arab lands, who love serving Hashem and love living an observant Jewish life? Where do they fit in? And the answer is that at the time they didn't. They were expected to assimilate into the labor Zionist paradigm, into this program of Mamlachtiyut. And a lot of pressure was put on them to get with the program. We now come to 1967. And at this point, the Dor HaMedina, the baby boomers, the generation that was born around the time of statehood in the 1940s, comes of age. And with their coming of age, rock and roll comes to Israel. This is Havilonot HaGvoyim, the High Windows, Israel's first homegrown rock group. And still, in many people's opinion, one of the greatest rock groups that Israel has ever produced. And what's incredible about their first and only album is that in between all the songs on the playlist that are about teenage angst and love and longing is a song about longing for Judaism. Efohem Kol Avotenu. This album is one that Israelis who are now in their 60s and 70s often know off by heart, because it really marked the arrival of rock music in Israel. Israel had the infamy of being the only non-communist country to ban the Beatles from performing on its soil. And this was a spoof on that. You see the foreign minister, Golda Meir, saying, Lo tavo, you're not coming. And the Beatles say, Ken navo, yes, we will come. It wasn't until 1967 that the High Windows released their album and that the censors started to allow rock music to be played on the airwaves. The group, which was only together for 2 years, consisted of 3 of Israel's most gifted musicians. The woman standing on the right is Josie Katz, who is originally from Pittsburgh. She's one of a number of American and Canadian Olim who helped to pioneer rock music in Israel. She's leaning on her then husband, Shmulik Kraus, who was a brilliant and very tormented Israeli poet and songwriter. And on the left is the great Arik Einstein, who had a career spanning 50 years and is one of Israel's greatest singer-songwriters. So the song is called Efohem Kol Avotenu, Where Are Our Fathers? And it's a song where these representatives of the Dor HaMedina, the first generation to be born in a free Jewish state, are asking, what happened to a living Judaism? We want more than this mamlachtiyut, than this Judaism that's just about the national story. We want to feel a personal connection, the way our ancestors did. So let's give it a listen. This song really moved me when I first heard it. And I had to find out what happened to Josie and Shmulik and Arik, whether they lived out this longing for Judaism that they sing about. And as it turns out, the three of them spent their entire lives in the Jew-Israeli camp, in that they valued Jewish tradition, but were not observant. But it's remarkable to look at what happened to their kids. Shmulik and Josie's son, Chen Kraus, is today one of the leading teachers of Torah-based mindfulness in Israel, a movement that has really taken off in the last 20 years. Arik Einstein's descendants are all either religious Zionist or Haredi. And when Arik died in 2014, the entire country went into mourning. He was given one of the largest public funerals any Israeli has ever received. And all of his children who were dressed very obviously as Haredim or as religious Zionists, spoke at the funeral. And it was so evident that despite the differences in their ways of life, they had so much love for their father and had maintained such a connection. And this was a very powerful moment in Israeli culture of Ahavat Yisrael, a recognition that despite everything that divides Dati'im and Chilonim, religiously observant Israelis and secular Israelis, there is a deep current running underneath, which is a love for the Jewish people in Judaism that is shared. And that's something that I think is so important for us to hold fast to. It can be very easy to get swept away by the sometimes toxic discourse between the two camps. But there is a very deep commonality underneath it. In 1977, Menachem Begin was elected prime minister, ending a 29-year hegemony of the Labour Party and ending the era of mamlachtiyut. Begin had a very different understanding of what it meant to be a Jew and what it meant to be an Israeli. If the Labour Zionists had conveyed to traditional Jews, you've got to get with the program, you've got to modernize and become part of the national project. Begin's message to them was, we love you the way you are. If you want to live a traditional Jewish life, you can contribute a lot to the state of Israel by doing just that. The only thing that he really cared about is that Jews give up a feeling of passivity and learn to defend themselves. You notice that Begin is wearing a kippah at his election night party, something that no prior Israeli prime minister would have been caught dead doing. He's also wearing a tie, which no prior Israeli prime minister would have been caught dead doing. And on the right-hand side, you can see that a number of the people, a number of his supporters are Mizrahim, are traditional Jews from Arab lands. And around the time of Begin's election, Sephardi culture began to really come out of the closet. Until the late 1970s, Sephardi music, which is so rich, was banned from the Israeli airwaves. It was seen as primitive. You only ever heard European Ashkenazi music. But all of a sudden, there was this upsurge of Sephardi talent that came out into the open. And beginning in the 1990s, a synthesis emerged where you started to hear a kind of music that was neither Eastern or Western, neither Sephardi or Ashkenazi, neither traditionally Jewish or modern, but a balagan, an amalgam of all of the above that is uniquely Israeli. And one of the most important vehicles for this is the piyut, the prayer poem. Piyutim have existed for the last 1,000 years since the late era of the Babylonian Jewish community. What makes them different from our tefillot is that they're not sung by the Baal Tefillah or the Chazan in shul, but they're sung by everyone together. We're talking about things like En Kelokenu or Adon Olam or Yigdal, and of course the piyutim that we say on Shabbat and on Chagim. It's a much more individual expression to God. And what we're looking at here are posters for festivals of piyutim. There are several every year where you see some of Israel's best artists, people who are religiously observant and people who are not, writing piyutim, sometimes taking piyutim from our Masorah, from our liturgy, and putting them into new settings, sometimes writing new ones from scratch. And one of the first Israeli artists to start this, this craze for piyutim was Meir Banai. He was a balladeer, a singer-songwriter. Some have called him Israel's answer to Bob Dylan. And in the early 1990s, he was Choser B'Tshuva. Now, it isn't newsworthy anymore when an Israeli artist comes out as religious. There have been too many to count. But he was one of the very first to do so. And in 2000, he released a beautiful album called Shema Koli, which was a collection of piyutim that he had set to music. And we're going to listen to his setting of Lecha Eli, which is a piyut by Rabbeinu Avraham Ibn Ezra that we recite at the beginning of Yom Kippur. It gives thanks to Hashem for creating each of us, for taking us through life, and for gathering us in when we die. The Ibn Ezra who wrote this is the same Ibn Ezra who's considered to be one of the greatest Meforshim, commentators on the Chumash, second only to Rashi. But he was also a poet. Only in the golden age of Spanish Jewry could you find Gedolei Torah, who were both great Torah authorities and halachic authorities, and also wrote beautiful poetry. So we're going to listen to a recent version of Lecha Eli with three very different performers representing the different sectors of Israeli society. The woman on the left is Tal Gordon. She's very much an Israeli, someone who loves Israel and the Jewish people, but is not so into traditional Judaism. On the right, we have Omer Koren, who comes from a Bukharian family, a family that made Aliyah from Uzbekistan. He's very connected to traditional Jewish life, although he's not strictly observant. And in the middle is Narkis. She is a Chozeret B'Tshuva, someone who took on religious observance and identifies as Haredi, ultra-Orthodox. But because she already had a thriving performing career at the time that she became observant, she got a cheter, an exemption of sorts, from her Rav to continue performing because he recognized that Hashem had given her a gift through which she could be kiruv levavot. She could reach out to people's hearts and share her love of Torah with them through her music. Where is my pointer? There we go.
לי תשוקתי בכך אשקי ואהבתי לך ליבי וכליותיי לך רוחי ונשמעתי
לך ידיי, לך רגליי, וממחי תכונתי, לך עצמי, לך דמי,
עד תאיר את אפלתי לך אזעק בך אדבק עד שובי לאדמתי לך מלכות, לך גאות, לך תאות תהילתי, לך עזרה בעת צרה, אהיה עזרי בצרתי. יהי סתרי וסוכתי ותחת צל כנפך תנענע את מחיצתי.
So this brings us up to the present. Israel is the startup nation. It's a hub of high-tech energy and innovation. And the nationalistic oriented culture has given way to greater individualism. To be sure, Israelis are still shaped by a feeling of chiyuv, of obligation to the state to serve in the army and work in its interest. But there's no longer this ideological fervor. There's no longer one concept of what an Israeli should be. Israel has become incredibly diverse ethnically and in its expressions of Judaism, despite the control that the Rabbanut expresses. And a turn towards individualism has been good for Judaism because it's freed people to explore for themselves what role they want Judaism to play in their lives, and to write and teach and sing about their personal Jewish experience. And one of the people who does it best in 2021 is Yishai Ribo. Many of Yishai's best songs are personal piyutim that he's written. To tell you a bit about Yishai, he grew up in Marseille, France. He's the son of Algerian refugees. And although he only made Aliyah about 10 years ago, he's mastered the Hebrew language and become one of the most beloved contemporary singer-songwriters. When I was in Israel last October, I heard his music being played on buses and in my friends' homes. I heard people singing it to each other. I heard it in shul on Rosh Hashanah. Yishai spends his mornings learning in a kollel. He spends his afternoons in the studio composing and recording, and spends many of his evenings performing for religious and secular audiences. It sounds to me like a pretty good life. He was moved to write a song when the coronavirus pandemic started, which he calls Keter Melucha. Of course, Keter Melucha is a theme on both Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. In the Musaf, we chant, V'yitnu lecha Keter Melucha, will give you Hashem a crown of kinship. And the coronavirus is so called because it's shaped like a corona or like a crown. So he plays off of that in this song. And he wrote, I'm sending this song to the people of Israel in the hope that we'll return to being a free people very soon. And I'll give you a little spoiler alert before we play this. He wrote this just before Pesach last year. That was at a time when Israel seemed to have beaten the pandemic. Unfortunately, it took a year longer before things really cleared up. But that's why at the end he talks about going free.
בין תרומה לתצווה, יום הולדת קצת משונה, הכל רגיל כאן לכאורה, במה קל ואהבה, בין תצווה לכי תישא, אסתר פורים משתה שמחה, מי יחנה ומי יישא, ומי יישא בתוצאה, בין כי תישא לבי יקל, עולם מפסיק להתקהל, להשתתק, להסתגר, ישמעאל, אדום וישראל, בין ויקל לפקודה, אין איש בעיר ובשדה, כבר אין מול מי להתנהל, מגדל בבל שוב מתבלבל. ומה אתה רוצה שנבין מזה? איך מתרחקים ומתקרבים בכאב הזה? רוצה לחיות אותך ולא להיות לבד. ומה אתה רוצה שנלמד מזה? ואיך נדע להתאחד בפירוד הזה? עד שניתן לך כתר מלוכה, כתר מלוכה. בין פקודה לויקרא, כולנו באותה סירה, אביב הגיע פסח בא, ואיתו תקווה רבה, שתקרא את רוע הגזרה, לך דודי לקראת קלה, כבר אין לנו כוחות יותר להתמודד, להילחם. ומה אתה רוצה שנבין מזה? איך מתרחקים ומתקרבים בכאב הזה? רוצה לחיות אותך ולא להיות לבד. ומה אתה רוצה שנלמד מזה? ואיך נדע להתאחד בפירוד הזה? עד שניתן לך כתר מלוכה. ומה אתה רוצה שנבין מזה? איך מתרחקים ומתקרבים בכאב הזה? רוצה לחיות אותך ולא להיות לבד. ומה אתה רוצה שנלמד מזה? ואיך נדע להתאחד בפירוד הזה? עד שניתן לך כתר מלוכה, כתר מלוכה. רוצה שנבין מזה, איך מתנתקים ומתחברים אל הלב הזה. רוצה לחיות אותך ולא להיות לבד. ומה אתה רוצה שנלמד מזה, ואיך נדע להתאחד בפירוד הזה. שמע ישראל השם אחד ושמו אחד. בין אדר לבין ניסן נפל פור זה הגורל, אומרים זה זמן שמסוגל לנצח המזל.
I feel like we could do an entire program about this song. There's so much to unpack, but since we only have another 5 minutes, I'm going to highlight a couple of things that really jump out at me. The first thing to note that I notice about this is that, like Israeli Judaism at its best, Yishai is able to be very rooted in the Masorah, in the tradition, and so individualistic and personal at the same time. The whole thing is written in Rabbinic Hebrew and using the rhyme scheme of a piyut. But he manages to inject his own personality and ideas into it. What's this whole business about the Keter Melucha? How is he trying to connect this to COVID? Well, I think about how when Rav Soloveitchik writes about the Keter Melucha, he's talking about how it calls us to recognize that Hashem is immanent, is present in everything. Like we say on Rosh Hashanah, Lashem haaretz u'miloah tevel v'yoshvei ba. The Hashem is literally within the world and all that it contains. And kingship means recognizing that. How does this relate to COVID? It means recognizing that Hashem is in each one of us. The way that we answer Yishai's question about how do we find unity in our separation when we're all stuck isolating at home is to recognize that Hashem is in each of us, and therefore we're never alone. We're connected to each other. We're connected to Hashem in every moment. And we're called to recognize the godliness in everyone and give them the support and the respect that they need at this time. And that's why he ends with the words of the Shema. And the Zohar interprets the Shema to mean that when it says, Ad Hashem echad u'shmo echad, God is one and his name is one. Who is God's name? God's name is us. We are the people who proclaim Hashem's existence through our beliefs, but primarily through our actions, because when we go to Shemayim, we're judged on how we've acted in this life, not on what we've believed. And so we are Hashem's name, and we manifest that through what we do, ben adam lechavero, between people, as well as ben adam lemakom, towards Hashem. And he's also, I think, calling on us to recognize that in od milvado, there is nothing other than Hashem, that even though we can't understand this crazy pandemic and the suffering that's gone on, that even here Hashem is present and we are not ultimately in control. it's such a paradigm of our society to think that with our technology and our scientific rationalism, we can control what goes on around us. But I think if Corona has taught us anything, it's to realize that control is not all that it's cracked up to be. That we have real limits on what we can do. And as Jews, we recognize that Hashem is behind it all. And we need to have bitachon, have acceptance of that at all times, but especially right now. So to conclude, we've come full circle. We've come from mamlachtiyut, from a concept of Judaism as being there to serve the state, to be a resource for the national identity, to be about the collective experience. And we've seen how Judaism has evolved in Israeli society to become both a national and an individual experience. The first song that we listened to was all phrased in the plural, but the later songs that we listened to use both the Yechid and the Rabim, the singular and the plural songs, and the plural forms, because both individual and collective experience matter today in how Israelis understand their Judaism. And you don't have to be in Israel, and you don't have to be fluent in Hebrew to be able to experience the renaissance of Israeli Jewish music. It's never been easier to access. You can find it on YouTube. Many songs are there with subtitles. You can find it on your favorite streaming audio channel. And for me, and I know for many others, it's a wonderful way to stay tuned in to Israel, which I miss very, very much. It's been 7 years since I lived there, but I listen to Israeli music every day. Sometimes I translate it and put it on YouTube. And it's been a tremendous kesher, a tremendous way to stay connected. To be a Jew, to be a Yehudi, to be a Yisrael, is to be someone who wrestles with God and wrestles with humanity as Yaakov Avinu did. And as I think we've seen from these songs, especially the later ones, Israelis are doing that wrestling day by day as they live out the adventure of creating a Jewish democratic state. And I think even if we're in the diaspora, it is the most exciting thing happening in the Jewish world, and something that can inspire us and compel us to wrestle with Hashem and with others in a more profound way. So I wish us all happy listening and good wrestling. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So I know that the hour is late, and so I know that Ari's, well, you have a couple hours until Francesca gets
I
home,
do.
right? So you're
I
not
do.
going anywhere. So if anyone wants to stay, you're certainly welcome to. And if not, I know everyone joins me in thanking you so much for this wonderful presentation. Also, I just want to draw oh, see you getting claps. I just want to draw attention. I didn't want to interrupt, but Carol had asked about the name of the performance group and the source of the recording. That was about the first song, the Chalutzi-ish one. And then Rena had asked if there's an album in which the three performers sing together. I think it was the third song.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, so I'm happy to stick around for as long as others would like to stick around to chat now. So the group that performed the first one was the IDF choir, in keeping with the nationalistic phase of Israeli history that it came out of. Military choirs were very, very popular in those days. And you notice that it was a choir, just as they were singing nationalistic music. It was a collective experience. It wasn't an individual singing in their own voice or singing about their own experience. It's very much about the power of the state and of the Jewish people. And the third one, I don't think those artists have ever cut an album together. At least I haven't seen it. That music video is the only time I've ever seen them collaborate. All of the stuff that I shared with you is up on YouTube. And I've also posted my translations there. Are there more questions? See, there's a lot in the chat box. People were asking for links to the songs. I'll be happy to send that out as a follow-up email.
Yeah, maybe Ari can, if folks want, can maybe you put your email address in the chat
Absolutely.
so that they can reach out to you for more information? Thanks.
Perfect. Yeah, and this was just a small sample. There are a lot of other wonderful things that I can recommend if people would like to do more listening. Okay, there's my email.
Yeah, you just sent that to me.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay, send to everyone.
Mhm.
There we go. If people would like to share anything or ask anything now, please feel free to unmute yourself.
I wonder if the heter for the person who sings from the Orthodox community, you know, has been brought up with other female performers in Israel. I feel like they have a lot to share. Just, yeah, it's such an interest, like Kol Isha and Israeli music and Jewish music is an interesting topic that I've been aware of through day school and beyond. So I wonder if, you know, there's any other discussion going on in the Orthodox or open Orthodox world.
Yeah, it definitely is an issue, because even in the Dati Lumi community, the religious Zionist community, where you're starting little by little to see women getting smicha. In fact, just this month, for the first time, a woman who had smicha from, who like me has smicha from Rabbi Riskin, assumed the leadership of a shul. But you will never see religious Zionist women performing. It's quite rare. The interesting thing is there are a couple of Haredi women who perform, and the most famous of them, Eddie Ankri, who was one of Israel's top Generation X pop artists in the 90s, and is today Haredi. She pointed out that part of the reason why her Rav was prepared to do it is because she dresses Haredi on stage and wherever she goes. So there's no mistaking that she's a Yoreh Shemayim. Now, I'm not saying that to agree with what she's saying. I have issues with the issue of Kol Isha, but that was the perspective that her Rav was coming from. that and that gave him, allowed him to be makel in this area in a way that a religious Zionist rabbi probably wouldn't have been comfortable doing.
It's fascinating. Thanks.
Yeah. It'll be very interesting to see what happens around the issue of Kol Isha in the next generation. There are actually a few all-women groups who only perform for women, and even have intros to their YouTube videos where they ask that only women watch the videos. Any other reflections?
Burn. I will we always include the links to all of the recordings of our lectures and upcoming emails. So if anyone missed anything, you can always watch the recording and come back to it. Thank you so much, Ari, for this wonderful presentation. Thank you to everybody for coming.
Thank you. It was fascinating. I loved it.
Excellent. You're number one fan.
and being a professional classical musician, it was, who's been able to perform several times in Israel. It's been, it was just, this was really enlightening.
Yeah, it's great stuff.
Well,
I look forward to meeting all of you that I haven't had the pleasure of meeting in person yet very soon. And we should all be well and get to a better time.
Yeah. All right. Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Good
Lila
night.
Tov.